There are places in America where people disappear, and sometimes the wilderness gives absolutely nothing back. No clear trail, no final message, no explanation. Just an empty stretch of forest where someone was supposed to be. But this story begins with something even more disturbing. A hiker went into the wilderness expecting to come back before dark. He had the equipment, he knew the trail, and there was nothing unusual about the weather. Then at some point during the hike, he vanished. Search teams would later walk through the same area. Dogs would search the surrounding trails. Helicopters would scan the trees from above. But the deeper they searched, the stranger the disappearance became. Because eventually, investigators found something that suggested the hiker had not simply gotten lost. Something had happened out there. And whatever happened, left behind a question nobody could completely answer. Where did the hiker go? Part 1, The Last Trail. It was supposed to be an ordinary hike, the kind of day experienced hikers take without thinking twice. A backpack, water, basic survival gear, and a trail disappearing into miles of wilderness. Nothing about the beginning of the journey suggested danger. There was no emergency call, no warning message, no desperate final conversation. The hiker simply entered the wilderness and continued deeper into the trail. For a while, everything appeared normal. But then came the moment that would later become the most important part of the entire investigation. The hiker stopped following the expected route. At first, nobody thought much of it. People take wrong turns, trails become difficult to follow. A person may decide to explore a different path. But when the hiker failed to return, concern quickly turned into fear. Friends tried calling. There was no answer. Then the hours passed. Still nothing. By the time darkness covered the area, the situation had changed completely. This was no longer a late hiker. This was a missing person, and somewhere inside that enormous wilderness, someone was alone. Part 2, The Search. The search began as soon as authorities realized something was wrong. Teams entered the area and began working outward from the hiker's last known location. They checked the obvious places first. The main trail, nearby paths, steep slopes, water sources, places where someone might stop to rest. But the wilderness was enormous. Every tree looked like the next tree. Every trail seemed to disappear into another trail. And every minute that passed made the search harder. Then came the dogs. Search teams followed possible scent trails through the forest. Helicopters scanned areas that rescuers couldn't easily reach on foot. Ground teams moved through difficult terrain. But there was still no sign of the missing hiker. No clear trail, no obvious accident site, nothing that explained where he had gone. And that was when investigators faced their first terrifying possibility. Maybe they weren't searching in the right direction. Because if the hiker had simply become lost, there should have been some trace. A footprint, a piece of equipment, a discarded item, something. Instead, the wilderness seemed to have swallowed him. And then during the search, investigators found the first clue. It wasn't what they expected. It was small, easy to overlook, but once they understood what it meant, the entire disappearance began to look different. Part 3, The First Clue. The clue changed everything. Searchers had been operating under one basic assumption. The hiker had become lost or injured somewhere along the trail. But the evidence they discovered didn't fit neatly into that theory. Something about the location was wrong. The distance didn't make sense. The direction didn't make sense. And most importantly, there was no obvious reason for the hiker to have gone there. Investigators began reconstructing the final hours. Where had the hiker started? Which direction had he taken? When was he last seen? And what could have made him leave the expected route? The more they examined the timeline, the more unsettling it became. Because there was a narrow window of time in which the hiker disappeared. A period when someone could have seen him, followed him, or encountered him. But there was no confirmed witness, no reliable explanation, only a trail leading deeper into the wilderness. And somewhere beyond that trail, the answers were waiting. Or perhaps something else was, because the next discovery would force the search team to consider a possibility they had not wanted to consider. The hiker may not have simply disappeared. He may have been led somewhere. Part 4, The Wrong Direction. The search teams went back over everything. The last known location, the trail, the surrounding terrain, every detail that could tell them where the hiker had gone. But wilderness searches have one terrifying problem. A person can disappear only a few hundred feet from a trail and still remain almost impossible to find. Dense trees can hide a person from the air, rock formations can create blind spots, and steep terrain can turn a short distance into hours of searching. So the teams expanded the search. They moved beyond the obvious route. They checked areas that looked unlikely. And slowly, the map became covered with search zones, but the missing hiker was still nowhere. Then the weather began to change. Cold air moved through the wilderness. Visibility dropped, and every hour made the chances of finding him alive smaller. The searchers knew they were racing against time. But there was another possibility nobody wanted to ignore. What if the hiker had never planned to go that far? What if something had happened after he left the main trail? And what if the last place anyone expected to find him was exactly where the search needed to go? Part 5, Something in the Woods. Days passed. The wilderness remained silent. Search teams continued working through the area, but the forest offered almost nothing. Then a searcher noticed something unusual. It wasn't dramatic. There was no obvious sign of an accident, just a small object lying where it shouldn't have been. The team stopped. They examined it carefully, and for the first time, they had something that could potentially connect the missing hiker to a specific location. But there was a problem. The object didn't explain what had happened. It only raised another question. Why was it there? Had the hiker dropped it? Had he stopped in that area? Or had something happened that forced him away from the trail? The team searched the surrounding ground. They looked between the trees. They checked the slope below. Nothing. No clear answer. Just wilderness. And that's when the search became something more than a rescue operation. It became a reconstruction. Investigators began asking, what was the hiker doing in the final hours? Where was he trying to go? And what could have caused him to leave the route? Part 6, The Last Possibility. At this point, several explanations were possible. An accident, a fall, disorientation, a sudden medical emergency, or simply becoming lost in terrain that was much more dangerous than it appeared. None of those explanations required anything supernatural, and that is important, because wilderness disappearances can feel impossible. Without anything paranormal actually happening, a person can become disoriented. A familiar trail can suddenly look completely different. A small mistake can lead someone farther from safety. And once darkness arrives, that mistake can become deadly. But there was still one thing that bothered investigators: the timeline. Something about the final known movements didn't fit neatly together. There was a gap, a period of time nobody could completely account for. And whenever investigators looked at that gap, the same question returned. What happened during those missing hours? Part 7, The Silence. Eventually, the search had to confront the possibility nobody wanted. The hiker might never come home. Search crews had covered huge sections of difficult terrain. Dogs had been used. Aerial searches had been conducted. Ground teams had pushed into places most people would never willingly enter. And still, nothing. No definitive trail. No clear explanation. No final answer. For the people waiting at home, that silence was its own kind of horror. Because when someone dies in an accident, there is grief. But when someone simply disappears, there is uncertainty. You keep asking yourself whether they are still somewhere out there. You imagine the phone ringing. You imagine footsteps outside the door. You imagine that one impossible phone call saying, "We found him." But sometimes that call never comes. And that is what makes missing person cases so haunting. The story doesn't always end. Sometimes it simply stops. Part 8, What Really Happened. There are several theories that could explain a wilderness disappearance. A fall that nobody witnessed, a wrong turn that became impossible to reverse, exposure to extreme weather, or an accident in an isolated area. The human mind naturally wants a more mysterious explanation, something that makes the disappearance feel less random. But the wilderness doesn't need a monster to be terrifying. It only needs distance, darkness, silence, and one wrong decision. That's what makes these cases so disturbing. Because the person who disappears isn't always careless. Sometimes they're experienced. Sometimes they're prepared. Sometimes they know the trail. And still, something goes wrong. And when that happens, thousands of acres of wilderness can become a place where a person can simply vanish from the world. And perhaps the most frightening thought is this: the hiker may have been closer to help than anyone realized, but nobody knew exactly where to look. And by the time they did, it may have already been too late. In the end, the forest didn't give up its answer. No dramatic confession, no perfect explanation, just silence. And perhaps that's what makes a disappearance like this so disturbing. We like to believe that every mystery eventually has an answer, that every missing person can be found, that every trail eventually leads somewhere. But the wilderness doesn't work that way. A person can walk into the trees and leave behind almost nothing. A backpack, a footprint, a final location, maybe even a single unanswered message. And then, nothing. For the people who knew the hiker, the story doesn't end when the search ends. Every unfamiliar number can still feel like the phone call they've been waiting for. Every distant sound can bring back the same impossible thought. What if he's still out there? Maybe one day someone will discover the missing piece. Maybe a forgotten trail will reveal what happened. Or maybe the wilderness will keep its secret forever. Because sometimes the most terrifying mysteries aren't the ones with monsters. They're the ones where an ordinary person walks into an ordinary place and simply never comes back. So the next time you see a trail disappearing between the trees, remember this story. The forest may look peaceful from the outside, but beyond that trail, you have no idea what is waiting. And if you ever find yourself alone in the wilderness after dark, don't assume you're safe just because you can't see anything. Because sometimes, the scariest thing in the forest isn't what you can see, it's what you can't. This is the Hidden Fear Archive, and some stories are better left unexplained.